Okay, so for our last video, guys, we're going to finish our story here. Clearly, we can see it's about how Johnny Appleseed passed away because we see his gravestone. And then we're going to do our one vocabulary word, and then we're going to discuss briefly what you might want to add to the timeline. All right, so here we go.
Timeline. 1774, born. Around 1794, travels west. 1797, settles in Pennsylvania.
So here we see his gravestone. It's in quotes, Johnny Appleseed, because that's what people called him. John Chapman, he lived for others, which is such a cool thing to have on your gravestone. It shows that he really cared about everyone else more than he did himself.
John shared apple seeds, apple trees, and stories. Settlers gave him the nickname Johnny Appleseed. He died in Indiana in 1845. Johnny Appleseed's gravesite. Early 1800s, moves to Ohio. 1838, moves to Indiana. 1845, dies.
Okay, so that's the end of our story. Now it's up to you to come up with something else that you would add into this timeline here. So make sure you go back and watch, especially the second video, because we came up with some good ideas of things you might want to add in here during his lifetime. So the vocabulary word that we had today was settlers. And the way that that was used, so you guys can take out your notebooks and set it up with the date and vocabulary. If you haven't done this yet, just pause the video and go ahead and do that now. Then when you get back, our word is settlers. And what settlers are people who move with a group of others to live in a new country or area. So since settlers are people, obviously we know that this word is a noun. So there were lots of settlers that came to the United States, like when we learned about the Pilgrims on Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims came from England and settled in the United States. They were considered settlers. But these are people who lived in the United States already that were moving further west out towards California. And they were settlers too, because they were kind of discovering this new land. So a new area. So groups of people were heading west to discover this new area. And they were called settlers. And those were the people who Johnny Appleseed said, you know what, I'm going to be smart and I'm going to plant apple trees for these new settlers so that they can, survive here and have food. Now, in terms of our focus question, what kinds of information would you add to the timeline? A good example might be when we were back in our story. There were many things that you could add. This timeline only had, I think, 5 things on it total. So there were so many things that we read about today and things that we read about in John Chapman, Planter and Pioneer that you might want to include on this timeline. So make sure when you go and answer this question on your Google form, you take your time and you write a complete sentence. So you would start it by saying, I would add, and tell me what you would add to the timeline. All right, guys, reach out with any questions. Take your time. This should not be a very hard Google form today since we only have 1 sentence for vocab, and you just need to have an opinion on what you might add to the timeline. All right. Zoom with Murray at 10 o'clock. See ya.